And now, Bobby Fischer, f takes c5, a brilliant move, giving up that queen on the f6 square. In this video, Bobby Fischer destroys Mikhail Tal with an alien queen sacrifice, proving once and for all that Bobby Fischer is not human. In the game, Bobby opens 1e4 best by test, and Mikhail Tal 1c5, the Sicilian defense on the board, the most aggressive option against 1e4 from white. Now Bobby, knight f3, knight c6 from Mikhail Tal, and then d4 breaking in the center. We have the open Sicilian on the board. Now c takes, knight takes, and here Mikhail Tal goes for the very popular Taimanov variation with the move e6. Now this is a very flexible opening idea for black. It's going to have a wide variety of plans. Now here Bobby Fischer, knight to c3, standard developing idea, queen c7 on the board. And here Bobby throws a curveball. He goes for the more positional line, starting with the move g3. Now this move is very venomous against the Taimanov. The idea, of course, being you want to go bishop g2, get that bishop on the long diagonal where it does exert a lot of pressure on black's position. And now here, Mikhail Tal, how does he respond? He goes knight to f6, a very standard developing idea. And now Bobby Fischer, he throws a curveball with the move knight to b5, hitting the queen on the c7 square with the knight. All right, now the queen has to go somewhere in the game. Mikhail Tal, queen to b8, very solid idea. But now Bobby Fischer, bishop to f4, putting pressure on the queen on b8 once again. And what is Mikhail Tal going to do here? Well, he has a few different ideas. The strongest move is going to be e5, trying to block the center, and we get sort of a Sveshnikov-style pawn structure on the board. However, instead here, Mikhail Tal in this position, he makes a big mistake. Knight to e5, trying to block the attack of the bishop on the queen with the knight. However, this is a very big mistake out of the opening. Here, Bobby goes bishop e2, black goes bishop c5, and here Bobby Fischer shows his big idea. He takes the knight on e5 with the bishop. Now, what is Bobby's big idea here? Let's find out. Here, Mikhail Tal takes with the queen takes e5, but then Bobby Fischer expanding on the king side with the move f4, driving back the queen. Now the queen goes back to the b8 square, but then e5, Bobby Fischer getting more and more space in the center. And now already on move 12, Mikhail Tal has a very big decision to make. What do you do with the knight on f6? Well, it turns out if you retreat the knight, you're going to be in a world of trouble. For example, g8 is really the only good square for the knight, but once you do that, white just dominates the board. He can jump in knight to e4, knight d6 whenever he wants to. He's going to be just dominating the game. So here, he does not retreat the knight to g8. Instead, he goes a6 here, attacking the knight on the b5 square. Now, Bobby Fischer, what is he going to do in response? In the game, he does not retreat his knight. If you go back to a3 or d4, for example, you're going to be losing the big initiative you have in this game. So here, he takes the knight on f6. E takes f6. Of course, Mikhail Tal is going to take back on b5. A takes b5 on the board. But now Bobby Fischer, he takes the pawn on g7, ruining Mikhail Tal's pawn structure on the king side. Now, rook to g8 is forced. That is the only move that saves the rook. But now Bobby Fischer jumping in with the knight to e4, putting pressure on that hanging bishop on the c5 square. And real fast, if you're enjoying this content, go and smash that like button. It's the best thing you can do to help me out. So smash that like button. And now back to the content. Here, Mikhail Tal goes bishop e7, retreating the bishop, but then queen d4 for Bobby Fischer, jumping in with the queen and setting up his unbelievable queen sacrifice in just a few moves here. Now in this position, Mikhail Tal, rook to a4, putting pressure on the queen, a very active move. However, Bobby Fischer, he realizes you don't have to retreat the queen just yet. Instead, you can actually jump forward with the knight to the f6 square, knight to f6 on the board. Of course, that move forks both the rook and the king, and black here is virtually forced to take the knight on f6. So, bishop takes and then queen takes on the board, and real fast, I do want to show you, if black doesn't take the knight, let's say he goes king d8, then the key move for white is going to be queen to b6, and you do win the rook on g8 for absolutely nothing, so that would be a complete disaster. So instead of that, bishop takes f6 on the board for Mikhail Tal, and then queen takes f6. Now here, Mikhail Tal, queen c7, trying to get the queen into the game, and putting pressure on that pawn on c2. Now, of course, white can defend it with long castles, but that would leave the pawn on the a2 square hanging. However, Bobby Fischer, he calculated everything out in advance, and he actually long castles here. He gives up the pawn on a2 because he knows that pawn is poisoned. If you take it as black, your position just gets worse, so you don't want to do that. However, here, Mikhail Tal, he actually does take the pawn. Rook takes a2 on the board. Real fast, instead of that, perhaps something like queen d8, challenging the white queen on f6 would have been a stronger idea. But instead, rook takes a2 on the board for Mikhail Tal, and now Bobby Fischer, he just goes king b1, driving back the rook. Now the rook has to go somewhere. In the game, rook to a6 on the board, setting up a future attack on the queen on f6 if he can get the idea of e5 on the board. So that would be very, very dangerous. Now here, Bobby Fischer, bishop takes b5 on the board, winning the free pawn. And here, Mikhail Tal, rook b6, getting rook out of the attack. Of course, if he goes e5 right away, bishop takes a6 wins the rook, so that doesn't work. So instead, rook b6, driving back the bishop. Here, Bobby Fischer, bishop d3 on the board, the best square for the bishop, setting up threats on that h7 pawn. And now here, Mikhail Tal, this is the critical moment of the game. He goes e5, opening up the attack on Bobby Fischer's queen on the f6 square. Now, rook takes f6 is threatened, so what does Bobby do in this position? Well, he sits down, he slows down, he calculates, he works it all out, and here in this position, he takes the pawn on the e5 square, giving up the queen on f6. Why would he do this? Let's find out. Here, Mikhail Tal, obviously he takes the queen. If you don't do that, you're just going to be way worse and completely lost. So now, he takes f6 on the board, and here, Bobby Fischer, what does he have for the queen? Well, he has an extra rook, 2 pawns on the king side, and more importantly, the safer king. Black's king on e8 is just so incredibly vulnerable, and Black's going to have to waste a lot of time trying to win these pawns on the f6 and the g7 squares if he can win them at all. So overall, Bobby Fischer, believe it or not, has more than enough compensation for the missing queen here. Now in the game, Mikhail Tal, queen to c5, activating the queen, and then Fischer, bishop takes h7, winning the pawn on a7 and threatening the rook on g8. And here, there's no good way to defend the rook. Obviously, both f8 and h8 are guarded by the pawn on g7, so Mikhail Tal has to just give up the rook. So, queen g5, then bishop takes g8, then queen takes f6. So here, Mikhail Tal is slowly gobbling up these pawns. We'll have to see if Bobby Fischer can get this bishop out of the g8 square alive. Now here, rook h to f1, hitting the queen, and eyeing the f7 square. Now, Mikhail Tal, queen takes g7, but then Bobby Fischer, bishop takes f7. And of course, you can't take the bishop on f7 with the queen, as if you do, you give up the queen for just a rook and a bishop. And from there, Bobby is going to win the game with the rook versus the bishop and the extra pawns in the endgame. So instead of that, king d8 on the board, stepping out of the attack of the bishop on the king. But now, bishop to e6, that pawn on d7 is currently being pinned by the rook. And Bobby may be intending bishop takes d7 or even rook to f7 ideas in this position. Now here, queen to h6, putting pressure on that bishop on e6. But now, bishop takes d7. Of course, the queen no longer defending that d7 pawn. So bishop takes d7 is now a possibility. Now, bishop takes, and here's the idea. Bobby is going to win back that bishop. Here he goes rook to f7. And sooner or later, he's going to go rook takes d7 with either one of these rooks, and he's going to win it back. Of course, if Mikhail Tal tries to defend that bishop with, say, queen d6, then Bobby can take the bishop all the same, because if the queens and the rooks and the bishop get blown off the board, then Bobby's going to have those extra 2 pawns on the king side, and that is going to decide the game. So Mikhail Tal has a very difficult defensive task here. In the game, he takes the pawn on the h2 square, giving up the bishop on d7. Rook takes d7 on the board. So here, Bobby taking with the rook from d1 instead of f7. That way he can have 2 rooks on the 7th rank, and those rooks are just monsters. Now here, king to e8 from Mikhail Tal, trying to step out of the attack. And very importantly, Bobby Fischer cannot just outright checkmate Black. For example, if he goes, chasing the king can always move away. So Black is going to be safe here temporarily. Now in the game, Bobby, rook d to e7, king goes to d8, that is forced. Then rook d7, king to c8. And here, Bobby, rook c7, king d8, then rook f d7, king to e8. And here, finally, Bobby does break the symmetry. He doesn't go for a draw by repetition. Instead, he brings the rook back to the d1 square, rook to d1 on the board, and this defends the back rank and sets up rook takes b7 ideas. Now from here, b5 on the board for Mikhail Tal, trying to defend that pawn, but then rook b7, putting pressure on the pawn once again. Now queen to h5 defends the pawn, but here, Bobby Fischer, showing his chess genius. He plays the incredible move g5, trying to deflect the queen away from the defense of that b5 pawn. Here, if queen takes g4, then rook takes b5, wins the pawn on the queen side, and suddenly Bobby's going to have that 2 versus 0 pawn majority on the queen side, and that will be enough to decide the game in this queen versus 2 rooks endgame. Now from here, queen to h3 on the board. Mikhail Tal cannot take the pawn, but this move allows Bobby to go g5, and suddenly Bobby has that advanced pass pawn on the king side. He's now threatening to push that pawn down the board back to the g8 square. All right, queen to f3 on the board, threatening the rook on d1. Bobby sees that. He goes rook to e1, hitting the king on the e8 square. Now king to f8, rook takes b5, and suddenly Bobby finds himself in an endgame with the 2 rooks versus the queen, where he has 3 extra pawns. Bobby Fischer here showing that he's truly not human. All right, Mikhail Tal, king to g7, then rook b6, blocking off the king on the 6th rank. There are no king to f6, g6, or h6 ideas now. Now here, queen g3, putting pressure on the pawn, but Bobby Fischer rook d1, getting out of the way of the attack of the queen. Now queen c7, again threatening the rook. The only thing Mikhail Tal can do here is to constantly put pressure on the white rooks and hope they aren't defended. But here, Bobby, rook d to d6. Both of these rooks are defended. Bobby's in complete control here. Now queen to c8. Mikhail Tal again trying to defend. But here, Bobby, he just slowly improves his position. b3, the king goes h7. Now he goes rook to a6, setting up rook to a7 ideas. And here in this position, Mikhail Tal has had enough, and he resigns on the spot to Bobby Fischer and his truly alien queen sacrifice from this game. Wow, what a game. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. It's the best thing you can do to help me out. And beyond that, check out my Bobby Fischer playlist and comment down below what you thought of this incredible game by Bobby Fischer, including his crazy queen sacrifice. And I'll see you in the next video.